Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
On the night of March 6th, 2008, a little after 8:30 p.m., an Arab resident of East Jerusalem entered one of the most prestigious yeshivas in Jerusalem, the Mercaz HaRav, which in English means the Rav or Rabbi Center, a renowned yeshiva which had been established by the great Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who in the early years of the 20th century was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi in Palestine during the Palestinian Mandate. The Arab from East Jerusalem who had chosen not to be an Israeli citizen, but who had an Israeli identity card that gave him freedom of movement and travel throughout Israel, had a box with him as he entered the yeshiva, in which he carried an automatic Russian-made assault rifle known as a Kalashnikov. And without warning, he opened fire on students in Mercaz HaRav, stalking individual students as they tried to hide, terrified, among stacks of books. During 14 minutes of terror and murder, the attacker unloaded 500 to 600 bullets, shooting 19 individuals in all, murdering 8 of them. 4 of the yeshiva students shot to death were only 15 and 16 years old. Another 3 of the students murdered were 18 years old, and 1 was 26 years old. Of the other 11 who survived, 5 of them were taken to the hospital in critical condition. In the end, the attacker was shot to death by a part-time student, Yitzhak Dadon, and by an officer in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, Captain David Shapira. Both men, Yitzhak Dadon and David Shapira, had been students at one time at the Mercaz HaRav Yeshiva. I don't know how many of you recall the Mercaz HaRav massacre of March 6th, 2008. I do. I remember the horror, and I remember the heroism of Yitzhak Dadon and David Shapira. And I remember how Hamas celebrated the murder of 8 Israeli children, and how Palestinian television and newspapers called the murderer a martyr. But for me, it was an assault on my people, my family, an ocean away. In Israel, there were parents who lost the most precious part of their world, their beloved children. One of those children was Avraham David Moses, a 16-year-old yeshiva student from Efrat, murdered on that evening of March 6, 2008. And sitting with me now is Avraham David's father, Naftali Moses, who has written an amazing book, a response to his losing his son, Avraham David, entitled Mourning Under Glass, Reflections on a Son's Murder, available through Amazon in paperback. And Naftali Moses, thank you so much for joining us to sit with us.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to begin, I'm sure, I surely hope is how everybody begins. We are so, so sorry for your loss. And boy, you know, I have 5 children. I have now a 22-year-old son as we tape this interview together. Naftali, I can't imagine how I would go on. I mean, I know parents do, you have to. But as a father, you know my heart is with you more than I can ever express. And you're not the only father who has lost a child. First of all, the Jewish people are not the only people whose fathers have lost children, but you are part of my family. And I am very sorry that you lost your son. And I'm sorry for all the other parents who lost children that day. And I find this, and it's how I want to begin with you, I find your book, Mourning Under Glass, an enormous statement of courage on your part. If one goes on the website and reads about Mourning Under Glass, you talk about why you wrote it. But I want you to tell our audience, was it a full year after?
Yes.
Okay. Roughly a year after you began writing this book. Naftali, why did you want to write the book?
Well, I think there's really two reasons. People had been asking me, even during the first year after the attack, my son's murder, to speak at various times and various events. And I found it very, very difficult. I found it very, very difficult to speak about my son, even though I lecture on medical ethics for a living. This was very difficult, and I found it easier to write prepared remarks. And as I started doing that, the idea of maybe expanding that into something longer took root in my head. And the other reason has to do with attempting, like you said, that it's unimaginable to think about what it is to lose a son. And a bunch of the Mercaz HaRav families, we met a few months, I think 3, 4, 5 months after the massacre, and we were discussing the events of the evening. And everyone found out that their son was missing, was killed in different ways. But there was something that everyone had in common. And that was, even though looking back at the kind of, I don't know, the way that the things kind of domino effect kind of fell into place, that, you know, the son wasn't answering his cell phone, and then he wasn't listed as one of the wounded in any of the hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. Looking back, it was clear at a certain point that there was no other alternative other than he must have been killed. But there was no recognition rationally of that at all during the event, and everyone had the exact same experience. Everyone said, yes, looking back at point X, point Y, it should have been clear to us, and rationally, if you look, you know, connect the dots, it was clear there was no other alternative. But it didn't register with anybody. And when we were discussing this, one of the people said, you know, there's an apocryphal story about Maimonides when he was a doctor in Egypt. He was a sultan's doctor, that he was very much against magic, and he was for what was rational medicine at the time, scientific medicine of the time. And someone claimed, a magician claimed, that he had cured a young boy of blindness. And the Rambam said, well, bring me the magician, bring me the young boy. And he said, yes, it just happened yesterday. This boy had been blind since birth, and since yesterday, now he can see. The Rambam took out a number of colored handkerchiefs and showed them to the young boy and asked him, what color is this? What color is this? And the boy replied, this is red, this is green, this is yellow. And the Rambam looked at the magician and said, you are a charlatan, this is not true. And the magician, of course, Rambam was right, Maimonides was right, and the magician was astounded. He said, well, how did you know? This seemed to serve as a proof that he could really see. He could even see colors. And then Rambam said, someone who has been born blind and just became sighted would have no conception of color. And that, I think, summed up for all the parents that there's no conception of what losing a child can mean, because it's so, I don't know if there's some psychological mechanism that clicks in, but it's just impossible to fathom that. So even during that night, as we went on and on, it just didn't register. So the other reason was I wanted to somehow open up some type of window into explaining what the experience was like.
Naftali, has it been cathartic for you?
I'm sorry to say no. Maybe I shouldn't be sorry, but no. I didn't find it cathartic. I found it helpful in
How?
getting across points that I thought were important to express. A lot of the book is more or less based on the tension between private mourning and public memorial. That for us, one of the things that was very difficult for my family, there were 8 different families. For my family, the publicness of the event made mourning, in a certain sense, more difficult than it might have been if things were done in a more private way. So a lot of what I talk about in the book is exploring the tension between something that's one of the most intimate feelings of losing a child, and the way that this was broadcast to the world. And even from the start, there were, I don't know, 10, 15,000 people at the funeral. I don't know that many people. I don't know.
As I said, by the way, I remember it vividly. And it's already a number of years, and here I am in the United States. In my mind, the Israeli parent lives almost with the knowledge that every day his child, her child, is at risk in a way that's different than, for example, parents who have children here in the United States.
Yeah.
We should say you are originally from the United States.
Yes, I am.
From?
Long Island.
From Long Island. And you made Aliyah when?
1984.
With your wife?
No. I was as a single into yeshiva, and I've stayed since then. So it's almost 30 years.
Okay.
30 years.
We're aware that Israeli parents have a different degree of concern and anxiety over the well-being of their children than do American parents. And it's one thing to know something in theory, and then my understanding from other Israeli parents I've spoken with is that you live a life and you never expect this to happen to you. Is that fair for me to say about you?
Yes, it's almost, in a perverse way, it's kind of like winning the lottery or losing the, you know that somebody this happens to, but you never expect it's going to be you.
Okay. So to the extent to which you're comfortable doing so, take me through your experience that night. At what point is there the first hint of something going wrong,
Right.
and then just follow it through for us, the extent to which you're able to do so.
I was at home and actually studying. I have a 16-year-old son who then was 12, and we were sitting at home studying. The phone rang, and on the phone was my ex-wife, and she asked if we had heard that there had been a terrorist attack in the yeshiva. We said no. So we immediately turned on the news, watched the internet, turned on the radio, and started to follow events. Obviously, we immediately tried to get in contact with my son. And the first few minutes of news made it sound that like it was in a different part of the yeshiva than where my son studied, because he was only in high school. And there's a high school, and then there's the upper yeshiva for college-age students. And it wasn't clear at the beginning where this took place. And because my son was in the high school, we didn't think that it might have affected him. And it was very minor. The news was that maybe the terrorist had been killed already, and they didn't talk about other people had been killed. So maybe it sounded like kind of a failed terrorist event. As things went on, my son didn't answer his phone. A few other people who knew that my son studied there wound up calling. At one point, and this is when kind of one of the things that kind of twisted the tension, upped the tension a little bit, somebody from the yeshiva high school where he studied called up to ask if he was at home. And I said, excuse me, this means that he's missing, and you don't know where he is. And this was, another 16-year-old on the other end of the phone. And he kind of wanted to hang up the phone, but at least he answered me and he said, yes, we don't know where he is right now.
This is between 8:30 and 9 p.m.
Yeah. So after this, like I said, the tension kind of got heightened. And my son was one of 3 boys from our community who had all studied in the same elementary school who wound up going to the yeshiva. In the end, his study partner, his chavruta, was murdered together with him, who he had been a partner
What was his name?
Segev Pneel. And they had been killed together while they were studying. The 3rd boy from this group, his mother called me up and she said, well, I heard from my Avishai, assuming, of course, that we heard from Avram David. And she said, Avram David is okay, isn't he? And I said, no, we don't know where he is right now. And of course, there's nothing you could say to that. So she said, oh, and hung up the phone. We began to call as the kind of machinery of terror attacks in Israel went into play. They publicized phone numbers for hospitals, and we began to call the hospitals.
What are you feeling at this point?
Again, like I started saying, there's nothing registered that, where this path of searching was going to lead. There was really, like I said, it's such an incomprehensible idea of one's child being killed. It didn't register, and it was kind of like, I'm trying to get more information. I'm looking here, I'm calling there. And my son and I were sitting by with the internet on, and things were being updated every few minutes, and we're listening to the radio, and we're calling on the cell phone and on the house phone, the different hospitals. At a certain point, we found out that his study partner, his chavruta Segev, and him had been planning to study together that evening. And this became important because I called up one hospital because, again, these were young boys and they don't have identity cards, they don't have driver's licenses yet. So there was really no way to identify the children had been taken to the hospital. And at a certain point, we kept asking, is there a Moses there? Is there a Moses? No, no, no. Finally, a woman on the other end, one of the operators from the hospital, asked if he had braces. I said no, but I said, I think that his study partner, his chavruta, did have braces. And she said, hold on a minute, are you saying that there were 2 boys together? And I said, yes. And this was the first piece of information that sounded like it was going to lead us somewhere.
You were hoping at this point that he was only injured.
Right, that he was in the hospital. And she said to me, listen, I'm not supposed to tell you, but in Shaarei Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem, they took 2 boys and they're being operated now. So I said, thank you very much, and I took off in the car. And
were you in Efrat at this point?
Yes, I was in Efrat in the evening. And because my then 12-year-old was with me, this was now almost, I would say, must be close to 11 p.m. already. He just kind of naturally came with me in the car, and we drove very quickly into Jerusalem. We went to the hospital. We got to the emergency room, and we said, is there a Moses here? And we were completely expecting that we were going to find him in his chavruta, already out of the operating room, already in recovery. When we got there, he said, looked at the list and said, no, there's no Moses here. And I couldn't remember his partner's last name at that time. And then my ex-wife, I had called her, and we both met at the hospital. She arrived a few seconds later, and I asked her, what is Segev's last name? She told me Avichail. And I said, Avichail, is there an Avichail here? By any chance, someone heard the name Avichail and said, who said that? And I said, it was us. And he said, come with me. He took us down a few hallways up to a different room, and there were the parents of my son's friend. And just as we walked into this room, his mother, Segev's mother, his name is Moria, turned around and gave me this look. I could only describe it as, I don't know, like the most heart-crushing despair you can imagine, because they had just shown them 2 snapshots of the boys who were in the operating room, and it wasn't our children. And she just turned and looked and said, it's not them. And at this point, like I said, rationally looking back, it should have been clear by this point that they had been killed. But it just didn't register. And we started checking with the police, and we started checking. And this went on almost for another hour of trying to think where they may have been. hope against hope. And at a certain point, I got in touch. Nobody from the yeshiva had been answering the phones, let's say, since about 9:15, 9:30. Everyone had just turned off their telephones. I wound up talking to my son's dorm counselor, whose number just happened to be in my cell phone. So I was constantly trying to call someone from the yeshiva to get some information. And he very, very calmly said to me, and this was a very good move on his part. He very calmly said, look, why don't you just come to the yeshiva? Everyone's here, all the kids are here. All the rabbis are here, all the teachers are here. I'm sure your son is here somewhere maybe, but very nonchalantly, very calmly, very matter-of-factly almost, just telling me something logical. This was about almost midnight. By then they knew already the identities of all the children who had been killed.
The man you were speaking to,
he knew,
did know your son.
This was a young man about 20 years old, and he knew. We got to the hospital. We got to the yeshiva from the hospital, about a 5-minute drive. My ex-wife decided to go check in the other Jerusalem hospital where the wounded were taken. We got there, and there was almost, I call it in my book, a carnival-like atmosphere. There were hundreds and hundreds of people. There were bright lights, there's flashing sirens going on, and hundreds of people standing there.
Media?
Media were there. There were some people already demonstrating on the other side of the fence across from the yeshiva. When we got there, we started looking for someone who could give us some type of direction. And again, just in speaking about it, rationally, it's clear that there's no other choice. Then we're going to find out my son has been killed. But at the moment, I just thought we're finally we're going to get some real information. We're going to find out what has been going on the entire evening. My son and I make our way from one policeman to an army officer, and there are a lot of social workers wandering around, and they have, like I said, it's almost a surreal scene. They are a corps of social workers who are called in any type of mass terror attack to help the people in the neighborhood, to help people like us, parents or children, whatever. And they're walking around with these fluorescent vests on that says social worker in Hebrew on the back of the vest. We go from one to another, and finally someone hears me say the name Moses, and her head turns, and she said, who said that? I said, it was me. She said, come with me. And I really breathed a sigh of relief. I said, finally, we're going to find out, we're going to find. And my son, my 12-year-old son is with me, and we're taken to one place, and people are talking amongst themselves, saying, well, we have to find a place to sit down. And again, it's obvious in retrospect, why they needed a place for us to sit. But it didn't register that. At the time, it didn't register. They finally take us, open a back gate to the yeshiva, take us up a flight of steps to the yeshiva study hall, to the Beit Midrash, and there is the head of the yeshiva, the headmaster of the yeshiva, and he comes down the half flight of steps as I go up to him, thinking, again, I'm finally going to find out what happened. And kind of meet halfway on the steps, and he just says to me, God takes and God gives away.
He obviously said it in Hebrew.
Yes.
Say it in Hebrew.
Hashem noten v'Hashem lokech. And that was the moment that everything obviously changed. So,
how long did it take for you to process?
I started to sense I'm still processing. And I think that night, so this was about midnight.
And your 12-year-old son is with you?
Yes, my 12-year-old son is with me.
And how does he take it? What's his name?
Elisha Dunn. I'll tell you, the first time he really cried, I think everyone was there was a certain amount of shock. They were just in shock. And there were a lot of details to be. There was all of a sudden this big funeral that people were planning around us. And
no, wait a minute. You've just learned on the steps that your son has been murdered. Do you sit down? Do you cry yourself? What happens in the next moment or two?
I'll tell you, like, we were in this kind of mode of finding information and using the phone, and this just kind of continued. I think the first time, I was going to say, you asked me about my son, the first time I cried after hearing the news wasn't right then. It was when I tried to get through to my father in New York on the cell phone, and it took a long time. There was a kind of also this surreal telephone call that he that evening was out for dinner with very old friends of his who knew me, were at my bris, were at my bar mitzvah, these people. And my father, being of a certain age, is not one of the people who has a cell phone. If he has it, it's not on. So I wound up calling their cell phone. And this woman answered the phone. She hadn't spoken to me maybe since my bar mitzvah. And she starts, talking. Oh, you're calling up. How are you doing? And I keep saying, I have to speak to my father. I have to. And she said, well, he's not here. I'm waiting in the restaurant. They're coming. They're on their way. And I said, I'll call you back. And she was very insulted. She was very insulted. And so about 10 minutes later, when my father finally arrived, I called up, and she angrily answered the phone. Said, you have some type of nerve. I know you since you were a baby. And I said, let me speak to my father. And I think telling him that his first grandson was dead, maybe having to say it myself, really, broke something open that had been closed, because we've really been in this mode of gathering information. And my son, the first time, he was also, I think, in shock. And the first time he cried wasn't until the next afternoon at the funeral, when we finally got back home for the second stage of the funeral, where his friends, his classmates, a bunch of 12-year-old boys were waiting for him. And that was the first time he really broke down also. So,
Naftali, were you angry? And if so, who were you angry at?
No, I wasn't angry. The only people I was angry at was much later, when I started viewing some of the media reports. That got me a little bit upset. The way that there was a lot of politics and a lot of ideology I realized had been placed into the way that certain reporters covered the events.
For example?
An Australian newspaper, I think maybe it was the Telegraph from the UK. They played up the angle, two mourning families, the family of the terrorist who had been killed, and our family.
And they picked yours?
Yes, because one of my, I think they managed to get through, they needed English speakers, and we were one of the only families with English speakers, and somehow they managed to get through to somebody and talk to somebody. That was not pleasant to see that. And this, I'm talking months later, when I finally went through all the media accounts. But I wasn't, someone asked me that even about my feeling towards the terrorists and the terrorist family isn't anger, it's just more astonishment almost at how someone could perpetrate something like this. It's just beyond me to comprehend what kind of I don't know, poison runs through this person's soul that enables him to shoot in cold blood, to go, like you mentioned in the introduction, there were 3 of the children who were murdered, and a few others who were shot, were crouching down in the stacks of the library. And he just methodically went and looked and checked and shot and went back to make sure that he had killed them. It's just unfathomable to me how someone could do that.
I want to make sure I understand. But you don't feel angry at him? And please, I don't mean to lead you. I don't want you to say it.
I understand.
But I think it's important for our audience to understand, because I think many of us would have assumed that part of the grief would have been turned into fury at this person, and you're being quite honest in saying that's not the emotion you experienced.
No, I really didn't. I really didn't feel. Again, it was just astonishment. Perhaps I would have felt differently. A few months ago, there was this deal that most people have heard about, where thousands of terrorists were released for Israelis' kidnapped soldier Gilad Shalit. They bring him back home from Gaza, and maybe if my quote-unquote terrorist had been one of those who was still alive and had been in prison and had been swapped out, maybe I would have felt the fury that these people feel at that person. But for whatever reason, I don't know, whatever reason, it's again just astonishment at the level of depravity and evil that could be in somebody. So
I want to make sure the audience understands. I know you will. I'm not in any way trying to justify what this individual did. To me, it is. I mean, the word heinous doesn't go far enough. But in their mentality, he wasn't evil.
No, certainly not. He was celebrated. They made his the equivalent of, while we were sitting Shiva for my son, his family was doing the Muslim equivalent, and in their case, he was celebrated as a martyr. And with all they call that type of mourning, they call a wedding in the Muslim tradition. They call it a wedding, and the wedding is because he's going to heaven with his 72 virgins, and because he died as a martyr fighting an enemy of Islam.
As we tape, this happened a little more than 4 years ago. Is it any less searing for you?
There are different times. As you can see, sometimes it's not easy for me to talk about. It's not easy for me to relive the events. And they're definitely, obviously the anniversary is a very difficult time. The Israel Memorial Day is a very difficult time. But kind of in between, life goes on. I have 3 other children, thank God. And life is made up of all the mundane moments that need to be taken care of and things that need to be done. But on occasions when I think about it, or occasions when I deal with it, it's not easy. It's still not easy.
Naftali, how do you identify yourself within the Jewish community? Are you part of the Orthodox community?
Yes.
Modern Orthodox?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you blame God for this?
No. That even my 12-year-old son, we were talking about it, and he said, at one point he said, well, we know it's like, a certain statistical probability, and now it fell upon us. That was his way of looking at it. No, I don't see that. I can understand where people could find themselves moving in that direction, but it didn't. It wasn't part of my thinking.
In some way now, you understand you're part of a sub-community in the state of Israel.
Yes.
Do you know Seth Mendel?
Sure.
Seth Mendel lost his son Kobe.
Right.
And if you say it like you know him well.
Yes.
Talk to me about to what extent Seth Mendel. We've also profiled him here on Shalom TV, and when his son died, he ended up speaking at the nation's capital
Right.
at a rally for Israel. Yeah. You weren't there though, were
you?
No. I was there. It was extraordinary.
Yes. I remember him saying, my son didn't have a chance to say the Shema
Will you say it with me?
Yes,
You know, what? I mean, you know, just tear your heart out.
Sure.
You know, and then he and his wife Sherry have tried to establish connection for families who have gone through what you do.
Yes.
Have you had any personal contact with him that you can talk about?
Yeah, they run a series amongst their other organizations also. They run an organization which provides mostly for siblings the chance to go away to camps, and it's very good. I know it's difficult for me to put myself in the place of my children, what they exactly go through and how they process this. But I know as an adult, and I think it's the same for them, that you know, there's some type of connection between you know, two parents who've lost a child, which is just different than.
Yes.
And I think that the children also find this. I remember the first time when Seth came to visit during when we were sitting Shiva, I almost had, you know, kind of this this black humor. I said to him, "Now you can teach me the secret handshake."
I understand. I understand.
And I think for the children, it's also helpful that there's somebody who gets without having to explain it, without having to talk about what they've gone through.
Do your children live now with a different kind of fear?
I have a daughter now who's 11. So then 4 years ago, she was very frightened for a long time, and she slept with her mother and I together for many, many months. Afterwards, we wound up getting a rather unfriendly towards strangers dog at a certain point, even, just to explain to him, look, we have a dog, no one can get in. It was very difficult for her. My daughter, who I have an 8-year-old daughter who then was 4, so for her, you know, things didn't register well. And my 12-year-old, I don't know, he's a teenage boy, so he's very much enclosed in his own world. But it's a very important part of his life, the group of friends that he has from organizations, whether it's the Mendel Foundation or One Family Foundation, that he's very active in both of them. And he really has, you know, another circle of friends from these organizations we wouldn't have.
Do you live with any kind of different fear?
Fear, I don't think so.
Do you feel differently in any way about you and the state of Israel?
No, I don't think so. In terms of my Zionism, I think that someone once joked about Americans, you know, we're not talking about people who come from distressed communities in Israel as a kind of safety zone for them, but especially for Americans, someone once said, you know, the people who stay are the ones who like tomatoes. And that's, maybe there's something towards that, to that, but I think you really need more than that, you know, to really stay. And I was in the IDF for 12 years, doing reserve duty and sometimes unpleasant situations, and you have to have a certain level of commitment, I think, to want to stay there. And this didn't change mine.
Did you ever get to meet Dadon and Shapira, the two
Several times,
men?
sure.
What were they like?
Well, David Shapira is the type of person that if you have daughters, you hope that they marry. You know, he's a officer in the IDF, but he's very soft-spoken, very calm. He acted without a second thought. He didn't wait even when he arrived at the scene. He, you know, immediately, what they call in the IDF, moved towards contact with the terrorist, didn't wait outside. And he walked us through, near the first anniversary, all the families met, and he walked us through the evening from his perspective of you know, moving from step by step, what he heard, what he saw exactly, where he was, where the terrorist was.
Was that helpful?
Yes, it was helpful in terms of, you know, filling in missing pieces of information, and it was many months until I found out the exact spot, for example, where my son was shot. And there's holes in the tile floor still there. had gone through his body. And
What about Dodon?
Dodon, I know I met him, and he was also with us and described his role in that evening.
They were courageous.
Yes, yeah, very, very much so. Unfortunately, there were two police officers who arrived, who were first on the scene, and they were both just had finished their initial police training and were more or less trained as traffic policemen. We had a meeting also with the then head of the Jerusalem Police Department, and I asked him, these police, they kind of formed a perimeter, they kept people from approaching, but they didn't move towards contact with the terrorists. And I asked the Jerusalem chief of police then if this was what they should have done. And he looked at me, and I think he gave a very true answer. He said, no. But if they didn't do what they did, they would have been killed. They weren't prepared. They weren't trained. They weren't,
So you're not angry at them either?
No. It's, rumor has it, I didn't check up on it, that they quit the police force after this. Mm-hmm. But look, there's people know the story of Jacob getting the blessing from his father Isaac, that he dresses up. It's kind of in sheep's clothing, not in wolf's clothing. He dresses up in sheep's clothing and I think people like David Shapiro represent the ideal part of the community that I live in of religious Zionism, where on the outside you have to put the world of Esav, the world of war and the world of fighting, and deal with it, while on the inside you remain true to the Jewish voice. As the verse says, the hands are the hands of Esav, but the voice is the voice of Jacob. And I think that somebody like David Shapiro really epitomizes that.
I've asked you if you hate the attacker. You say no. Do you hate Arabs and Palestinians in general?
No, I think that if I did, I wouldn't be able to stay in the Middle East, because obviously, Israel is a kind of drop in the bucket. I think in terms of, I don't know how many hundreds of times more the population is bigger. I know the landmass 800 times more. And where I live, not in the middle of Tel Aviv. I live in Efrat, which is right outside Jerusalem. Right east of us is Bethlehem. And I have daily contact all the time with Arabs. I've worked with Arabs. I was, last summer, was in the hospital, and the last person I saw before I was put under was the Arab male nurse of the operating room. And,
There are people who come on Shalom TV, and they argue. Look at what happened to your children. Mm-hmm. Look at Itamar and the massacre of children in their beds in their sleep. And that ultimately there is within the Palestinian community such a hatred for the Jew. It's not about the Israeli, it's about the Jew. And they don't want any Zionist presence on Muslim territory. Mm-hmm. That whether it's right or wrong, the reality, they argue, is there will never be peace. Mm-hmm. There will never be a world in which a father might not get the phone call and have to go to the school as you did. Mm-hmm. Not because of anything you're doing, not because of anything your son did, except exist. Mm-hmm. And that it may be tragic, but this is the land of Israel, it's Eretz Yisrael, and ultimately we will never be able to live in peace. They obviously are against the two-state solution. They will never be able to live in peace with the Arab world. Mm-hmm. And I have a chance to ask someone who paid the ultimate price of a child, mm-hmm. How do you respond to them?
They might very well be correct. They might very well be right. I think that definitely the Arab leadership, like I said, I have a doctorate in history, in medical history, but I'm a little bit of a historian. So if you look historically, the Arab leadership in what was Palestine and became Israel has more or less taken that hard line of saying this is Muslim land and there are no Jews should be allowed to have any political rights here. They might very well be correct. So what? So what? Like, okay, like I said, we're not in China. We're not in Iowa. We're in the Middle East. We're a drop in the bucket surrounded by an ocean of Middle Easterners, Arabs. Okay, so we won't have peace. I don't delude myself into thinking that by doing, if only we would do X, Y, or Z, A, B, or C, then we'll come up with peace. No, I think that most people, I'd like to think that most people are inherently not as evil as someone who could perpetrate this. The people from Itamar, the 2 cousins, or the terrorist who killed my son and the 7 other boys at Mercaz HaRav. But I also asked myself, out of the billion Muslims, what percentage is enough to keep war against Israel going forever? Not a large percentage. 100,000? What percentage is that of 1 billion? 0.01, I think. And that's enough to keep war going.
So, Naftali, will there ever be peace for the state of Israel?
Well, we believe that at a certain point in time.
You know what I mean. You know what I mean. Are you
not,
optimistic about any peace arrangement in the near future?
No. What's on the table now gives me no optimism.
Do you support a 2-state solution?
I think that
in concept.
In concept, I can imagine a 2-state solution allowing a certain amount of breathing room for each side. I don't believe that it will offer Israel long-term peace unless something drastically changes on the Arab side, because they don't consider Yehuda and Shomron, or the West Bank, whatever you'd like to call it, occupied land. They consider Tel Aviv occupied land. And again, even if it's not all the Arabs, what percentage of the billion Muslims do you need to be saying, we want Tel Aviv back, for there to be a perpetual state of war? So.
And yet at the same time, you have no intention of leaving.
No. I don't see why that would help anybody. You know?
I want you to read the names of the 8 children who died that night in that yeshiva.
Okay. Neria Cohen, 15, from Jerusalem. Segev Pneel Avichail, 15, from Neve Daniel. Yehonatan Yitzchak Eldar, 16, from Shiloh. Ro'i Roth, 18, from Elkanah. Yochai Lipschitz, 18, from Jerusalem. Yonadav Chaim Hirschfeld, 18, from Kovchav HaShachar. Doron Maharata, 26, from Ashdod. Avraham David Moses, 16, from Efrat.
Tell me about your son. Who was he? What was he like?
I think when people first saw him, they were taken by, he was a very good-looking boy. He had long blonde payas and sparkling blue eyes, and I think that was the first thing that people noticed about him. He was a very, very gifted student. He spent the last year of his life, he spent almost totally devoted towards Torah study. And when I mean totally devoted, I mean 18 hours a day of studying, of setting up his schedule such that he would get up at 5 in the morning and go to synagogue and be studying full time. I remember on his 15th birthday, I went to bring him a present, and I went to the dormitory during lunchtime, and I bumped into a few of the other students there. I didn't know exactly where his dorm room was, and I asked them, I said, "You are Avram David's father?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "And why do you think he's in the dormitory now?" I said, "Well, it's lunchtime, break after lunch, people are hanging out, taking it." I said, "Not Avram David, he's still in the study hall, he's in the Beis Midrash." And that was who my son was turning himself into. I think that because he came from a divorced home, his life wasn't as easy as any parent would like their child's life to be. And I think that towards the very end of his life, we had very serious discussions about the direction that he wanted to take in his studies and the difficulties that he found being in this intensive dormitory atmosphere. And on a certain level, I think he envisioned himself living the life of a Torah scholar. You know, if I would have asked him at 16 years old, where would you like to be in 5 years, 10 years, he would have said, right here in the study hall, learning. And
Naftali, you put together a very beautiful video tribute to your son. I'd like our audience to see it.
there's music that accompanies this video slideshow. And the musician is Yonatan Razel, who's an Israeli musician. And he participated. Every year, I put on a memorial concert for the anniversary of my son's death. And this was the recording from the first memorial concert, and that accompanies the pictures.
לבסנו ולנו שלא יכול בלבוד ומד עולנו לכאן ניסינו ומד עולנו לכאן ניסינו והיא שעמדה לאבותינו והיא שעמדה לאבותינו ולנו שלא אחד בלבד עמד עלינו לכלותנו עמד עלינו לכלותנו הקדוש ברוך הוא מצילנו אם מצילנו אם יודו שעמדה לאבותינו ולנו שלא אחד בלבד עומד עלינו לכלותנו עומד עלינו לכלותנו הקדוש ברוך הוא מצילנו כי מצילנו
That was, first of all, it was extraordinary. You're extraordinary. I started this way, I end this way. I can't tell you how sorry I am. Your son was very lucky to have you as a father. And it sounds to me like you were very lucky to have him as a son. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, and yet it has to be said. None of us is guaranteed any length of time on earth.
That's true.
And we have to use what we have, whatever length, as best as we can. Your son's life was cut so viciously short, and yet he seemed to have lived within his years with extraordinary purpose. Mm-hmm. I give his father some credit for that, and you were a blessing to him, and I know he lives in you every single day. It is my hope, Naftali, that everyone will pick up Mourning Under Glass, Reflections on a Son's Murder. There is so much in here not only of you, but of insight into what any father would go through, and also what the state of Israel is now confronting. And it has been an honor for me to sit with you. I hope we also meet under other circumstances. I would love to be in Israel maybe one time when you do the annual musical tribute to your son. You are always, always welcome here. And if there's any way we can help you in any way at all, we will. In the meantime, I wish you a kol tuv v'atzlacha in everything you do.
Thank you very much.
This was very, very sweet and wonderful of you. And you're a very wonderful man. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
My meeting with Naftali Moses, again, author of Mourning Under Glass, Reflections on a Son's Murder. You can pick it up through Amazon in paperback. Just go to the Amazon website. You've heard me say this all the time. I always want to know your reactions to anything that we do here on L'Chaim and Shalom TV. But if you would like also to be in touch with Naftali Moses yourself, you could do so by emailing me, and I will forward any email you send to him through me. I will forward it on to him. So again, please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'Chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.